They took vows of faith, devotion, and chastity, pledging their lives to God, believing the world could not touch the sanctity of their spirit. Yet the Ottoman Empire had its own laws, its own terrors, and in its shadow, horror far beyond death awaited them. The nuns moved silently through candlelit corridors, the faint smell of incense mixing with dust, their footsteps echoing against stone walls, unaware that the empire's soldiers were already drawing near. Monasteries, once places of peace and learning, suddenly became prisons, battlegrounds, and instruments of humiliation. For centuries, their stories were silenced, whispered only in the margins of history, until now. Imagine a life devoted to prayer and service being weaponized against you. Your faith tested not by the absence of danger, but by the presence of horrors designed to break your mind and your body. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, the Ottoman Empire spread across Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean, ruling over millions with an iron grip. Christians, Jews, and other minority groups lived under constant scrutiny. In this empire, piety could make a person a target, especially if that piety came in the form of cloistered women, secluded in monasteries, living lives of study, charity, and prayer. The empire's campaigns were not merely territorial, they were psychological and physical assaults on the very identities of those who lived within its reach. Convents, once safe havens, were vulnerable to sudden raids. Soldiers would storm them, breaking down doors, seizing women, separating them from their sisters, turning sacred halls into spaces of terror. Families fled, communities fractured, and the nuns found themselves isolated, facing abuses so cruel and calculating that the memory would haunt survivors for life. Survival in this context was not measured by the continuation of life, but by the endurance of body and soul through humiliation, deprivation, and relentless psychological torment. Ottoman soldiers and officials systematically targeted Christian women for capture, forced conversion, and servitude. Nuns were often chosen because their chastity, their religious discipline, made them symbols of resistance, and controlling them meant asserting dominance not only over individuals, but over entire communities. Women were isolated, coerced into impossible choices, and publicly shamed. Monasteries, the epicenters of faith and knowledge, were stripped of their autonomy. Sacred relics and manuscripts were confiscated. Convents became staging grounds for punishment, places where women were humiliated, controlled, and manipulated to serve the political and economic interests of the empire. The suffering inflicted was both physical and mental. Every forced gesture, every act of coercion, was intended to break the spirit, and yet the women endured, their faith and courage often hidden behind stoic expressions. Prayers whispered in the dark, hands clutching rosaries, eyes raised toward a God who seemed distant but not absent. The cruelties they suffered were rarely recorded in detail. Many accounts were lost, burned, or deliberately hidden to protect reputations. Survivors spoke in hushed tones. Letters and diaries hint at horrors that were too shameful or terrifying to be openly documented. Sexual exploitation, forced concubinage, and psychological torture were common. Some nuns were coerced into conversion, forced into marriages with their captors, or made to serve in ways that stripped them of dignity and autonomy. Wealth and artifacts were taken from the monasteries as additional tools of oppression, transforming places of devotion into instruments of humiliation. Each day in captivity was a negotiation between the will to survive and the urge to resist, a balancing act that demanded courage, intelligence, and unbroken faith. The empire's power extended into the most intimate aspects of their lives, making endurance itself a form of rebellion. The psychological impact on the victims was profound. Many lost trust in the structures of faith they had once revered. Physical and sexual violence left scars that would never fade, and the memory of forced service haunted them for decades. Nuns who resisted were often executed. Those who complied survived but carried lifelong trauma. Entire convents were emptied, communities terrorized, religious practices interrupted, and the spiritual networks that had sustained generations fractured. Imagine dedicating your entire existence to God, only to have that devotion used as a tool against you, weaponized by the very society that claimed to value faith. Even those who survived were burdened with the weight of experiences no one dared to acknowledge, lives forever marked by cruelty, secrecy, and the shadow of the empire. Historians piecing together these narratives relied on fragments, Ottoman administrative records, foreign diplomatic reports, monastery letters, and surviving diaries. Many details were hidden beneath layers of sanitized official narratives, requiring painstaking work to uncover. What emerged is a portrait of endurance and survival, of courage in the face of deliberate erasure. The fragments tell stories of whispered prayers, coded messages, and strategies of survival. They reveal the inner lives of women forced into impossible circumstances and remind us that, even when stripped of agency, human beings find ways to resist and endure. These secrets survive centuries of silence and destruction, and they demand recognition. The corridors of abandoned monasteries, the faded manuscripts, the whisper of candlelight in empty chapels, all are testimonies to lives subjected to horrors worse than death, lives that insisted on leaving traces, despite every effort to erase them. The empire's shadow did not end with the immediate suffering of the nuns. Its legacy extended across generations, shaping communities, altering lives, and leaving a scar on collective memory. Those who survived returned to convents that were emptied, stripped of relics, manuscripts, and sacred objects. The walls that had once echoed with hymns and whispered prayers were now silent, haunted by the absence of sisters, the loss of dignity, and the weight of untold horrors. Communities that had relied on the monasteries for education, healthcare, and charity found themselves bereft. Families mourned women who had disappeared without trace, and young novices grew up in the echo of fear, learning caution instead of faith. The Ottomans' cruelty was systemic, intentional, and meticulously executed, designed to instill terror and assert control, not just over individuals, but over entire networks of belief. Survival itself became a form of quiet rebellion, an assertion that faith and humanity could endure even when the body was enslaved and the mind assaulted. Some nuns attempted to record their experiences, writing in diaries or letters meant to be hidden. Each page was a testament to endurance, courage, and the fragile persistence of hope. In those fragmented accounts, one glimpses the strategies they developed: how to endure forced labor, how to maintain secrecy, how to navigate the psychological manipulation imposed by captors. Even the smallest acts of defiance, a whispered prayer, the concealment of a sacred relic, the protection of a younger novice, became monumental in the context of relentless oppression. The nuns' faith, once targeted for destruction, became a shield, a tool for survival, and a silent act of resistance. Their resilience defied the empire's designs, proving that control could never fully extinguish the human spirit, even under the most brutal conditions. Foreign observers, from Venetian diplomats to papal envoys, recorded fragments of the atrocities. Their reports often mention the fear and outrage among Christian populations, the disappearance of women, and the confiscation of monastic wealth. Yet even these accounts were filtered, softened, or limited by political necessity, leaving a partial, sanitized record. What survives are tantalizing hints, glimpses of horror, and occasional testimonies that refuse to be erased. Some monasteries took measures to commemorate lost sisters in secret, preserving memory despite fear of retribution. Candles were lit in hidden chapels, prayers whispered in secrecy, and stories passed down orally, ensuring that even if official records denied the truth, the lived experience endured. The empire attempted to obliterate their voices, but memory proved more resilient than oppression. The motives behind these acts were complex but calculated. The empire used sexual exploitation, forced conversion, and public humiliation as tools of political domination. Nuns represented moral authority, religious discipline, and symbolic power. By subjugating them, the Ottomans sent a message not just to individuals but to entire communities. The violations of faith and body were intertwined, each act reinforcing the other, creating a system in which terror was absolute. Psychological trauma was as deliberate as physical abuse. Each woman who survived carried the burden of witnessing the destruction of others, of enduring indignities meant to erase identity, of knowing that the world outside would often not acknowledge her suffering. Yet, even in the face of such calculated cruelty, these women maintained a fragile autonomy through prayer, community, and acts of concealed defiance. The historical impact of these horrors reverberated far beyond the initial victims. Entire Christian communities were destabilized. Educational programs, healthcare practices, and charitable work provided by convents were disrupted. Young girls who would have become novices were left vulnerable to capture, exploitation, and psychological terror. The trauma extended into cultural memory, shaping literature, oral histories, and religious practices. Families told stories of lost daughters, haunted by what they endured. Churches commemorated martyrs quietly, often in hidden ceremonies, preserving memory when official acknowledgement was impossible. The empire's acts against nuns were not isolated crimes. They were systemic strategies of domination that left enduring scars on societies, faith, and collective conscience. Modern historians, piecing together these narratives, face gaps, destroyed documents, and centuries of silence. Ottoman records provide bureaucratic detail, but conceal the human suffering they caused. Diaries, letters, and foreign reports offer fragments of experience, glimpses of fear, endurance, and quiet rebellion. Every recovered story is a testament to courage and survival. These accounts reveal the nuns' strategies, the acts of concealed heroism, and the resilience that allowed faith to survive in the shadow of systemic violence. The empire's shadow looms over these narratives, but within that darkness, the persistence of memory, testimony, and faith shines through. The nuns' suffering, once hidden, becomes a lens through which we can understand the human capacity for endurance and the moral imperative to bear witness. Today, ruins of monasteries stand as silent witnesses. Candles flicker in abandoned chapels, crosses are worn and faded, but the stories survive in archives, oral histories, and the occasional hidden diary. These sites are more than historical monuments. They are reminders of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and endurance. The nuns' lives, marked by terror, courage, and survival, demand acknowledgement. They endured horrors worse than death, and their memory compels us to confront the darkest aspects of power, faith, and oppression. The echoes of their suffering ripple across centuries, teaching that even in the most extreme conditions, dignity, courage, and resistance are never fully extinguished.